If you want to get into this in more detail, I've got this all covered in the book. The whole book is devoted to that subject. And just last Sunday, I was on Dr. Schuler's Hour of Power program, and he shared with me before the interview that in his 25 years of ministry experience, this has been the biggest barrier preventing non-Christians from adopting the Christian faith. This perception that science teaches billions of years and the Bible only teaches thousands. And he says, I sure wish somebody would write a book on this subject and straighten it all out, so I had a chance to offer him this little copy. He's reading through it right now. But I would agree. That's a significant issue. But you know, I never even realized it was an issue until I got to Caltech. My first 7.5 years as a Christian in Canada, I never met Christians. Didn't have the opportunity to find a church where people took the Bible seriously, and had no idea this was even a controversy. Because of my own study of Genesis 1, it was immediately obvious to me that only one of those three interpretations is internally consistent. And that's even true of the first chapter. Even within the first chapter, that's fairly obvious. There's an evening and a morning for the first 6 creation days. There is no evening and morning for the 7th day. The reason there's no evening and morning stated in the text for the 7th day is because we're still in it. The 7th day doesn't end until the problem of evil is conquered. Then we have the 8th day when God creates again. The 7th day is defined as that period of time when God rests, where He ceases from His work of creating. And therein I think we have a scientific piece of evidence to bring into play. And that is a comment we get from several leading ecologists. And we look out in the world of nature, we don't see evidence for animal speciation in real time. To quote Paul and Ann Ehrlich, we have yet to document the appearance of a single animal species in the world of nature. In the vast majority of cases, we cannot even detect any significant genetic change under real-time observations. But clearly we see it in the fossil record. As you look back into the fossil record, there's an abundance of evidence of fairly rapid speciation. Speciation at a rate of one new species showing up every year. But we don't see that today. Now, I admit when we look at the plants, we do see some evidence, but you can count them on a single hand. So we have an imbalance. Today we witness a tremendous extinction rate, and even if we remove all human input, that extinction rate still exceeds one species disappearing every year, as opposed to one disappearing every hour. But on the other side of the coin, we see a virtual zero at the speciation rate. But if you look back on the fossil record, the two are in balance. Every time a species disappears, a new one pops up. The biblical response to that, for 6 days God created, for 6 days He was replacing the species of life that went extinct, but on the 7th day He stopped doing that. So that's why we see speciation in the past, and we're not seeing it take place today, at least not at a level that's capable of balancing off the extinction rate. Now, when we move out of Genesis chapter 1, we come into the flood account. And I've run into numbers of people in the university campuses who will say, well, Dr. Ross, thank you for these insights into the creation account of Genesis 1. I now realize that the Bible gives us a very credible account of creation. It's the only account amongst religions that perfectly matches the scientific evidence and the scientific record. But I have even a greater problem with the flood account. You don't really expect me to believe that Noah took on board the ark 10 million pairs of species of life, and stored enough food for those species of life to survive for a whole year. And he only had 7 family members with him. How can 8 people possibly shovel fast enough to keep up with the excrement that would be produced from those millions of species of life? And you can laugh, but there was an article published by a leading atheist in one of the scientific journals describing the excrement problem of Noah's Ark. And on that basis, there is no credibility to the Christian faith. He was willing to write up all of Christianity just based on what he perceived to be an excrement problem. Now, once again, and then there's probably an even more difficult issue, and that is there's no evidence for a worldwide global flood. The Bible claims this worldwide global flood, but the geophysical evidence tells us that that's nonsense. And if it's geophysical nonsense, then surely the Bible is not a document that we can trust. Well, once again, I want to share that this idea that the Bible teaches a global flood is a recent phenomenon. In fact, it's just this century where it's been a popular teaching of the Christian community. 1923, only since 1923, has the doctrine of a global flood been taught throughout the Christian community. You'll find obscure writings to it before 1923, but nobody paid attention to them. Only since 1923 has it been popular. George McCready Price published a book back then as a Seventh-day Adventist promoting that view. Now, my wife is an English professor, retired now, but one of the things that she points out is that, yes, it is 20th century, but only because 20th century citizens equate globality with universality. We are global citizens. Therefore, anytime we see references to the whole face of the earth, we interpret that as global. But people living previous to the 20th century wouldn't do that. Their world would be a lot more limited than our world. Anybody in this audience who can come up with $2,000 can visit any city in the world he pleases, he or she pleases. But that was not true of our grandparents or generations living previous to that. And her point is that such references always must be interpreted in the context of the antecedent. And the Bible is filled with these examples. I'll give you one from the New Testament. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, says of the Romans, your faith has been heard throughout the entire world. Now, the citizens of Rome understood that he was not referring to the Aborigines in Australia or the Incas in Peru. The entire world of the citizens of Rome was the extent of the Roman Empire. And in that sense, Paul's boast of them was true. Their faith indeed had been heard throughout the extent of the Roman Empire, but that's as far as it went, but that was the entire world of the citizens of Rome. So when we get into texts like Genesis 7, where it states, let me just quote it for you, I think you'll get the problem that comes out here. It says of the flood waters, verse 19, chapter 7, they rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits, which is 22 feet or more, and every living thing that moved on the earth perished. Well, looking at that from the English perspective, you'd say, surely it's speaking of a global flood. And indeed, that's how it's been interpreted by 20th century readers of the English translation. But that's not how the previous 18 centuries of the church interpreted it. Why? Because as you examine it in the literal, in the Hebrew, the original language, you recognize, first of all, that in Hebrew, they have just one word to describe geologic relief of any height. And it's the word har. That can refer to Mount Everest. It can refer to a mound of garbage in your backyard or anything in between. Everything's covered by that one word har. And you say, well, what about this word high in front of it? In fact, some translations describe it as all the highest mountains. What you discover is that the adjective there in the Hebrew is a word that means elevated. So it's speaking about all the elevated hills or all the elevated mounds. Well, what about this phrase all? Well, let's put Noah in the middle of the Mesopotamian floodplain. What are all the hills he's going to be able to see? Well, if you're in the middle of that floodplain, you can't even see the mountains that exist at the edges of that floodplain. All you're going to see are the foothills of those mountains. So it could well be that this phrase, all the elevated har, may simply be referring to the foothills of these peaks that exist on three sides of the valley. I'm living in California now, and we have a similar valley, the San Joaquin Valley. It's about 3 times narrower than the Mesopotamian floodplain, but when you're in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley, you can't see the mountains on the right or the mountains on the left, even though they're much higher than the mountains that face both sides of the Mesopotamian plain. Now, it says the waters rose and covered these hills and or mountains or garbage mounds to a depth of more than 22 feet. What you discover is that the Hebrew verb for cover, it's the verb kasah, has 3 different definitions. So you have to figure out from the context which of the 3 different definitions to go with. Definition 1 would be a permanent covering of water sitting on top of those hills. Definition number 2 would be a fall fall of rain on top of those hills, adding up to 22 feet. The third possible definition